Hi, I'm Alex Howard, and welcome to Conscious 2. My guest in the studio today is Richard Wilson. Hi, Richard.
Hi.
And Richard is director of Oscar, a social change agency, and also author of the forthcoming book, Antihero. And today's interview, we're going to be discussing Richard's book and some of the principles behind it. Hi, Richard. So maybe as a starting point, what is an antihero?
It's a really good question. The way I'm talking about anti-heroes is really as a response to heroic or to traditional heroes. So it's not someone who is necessarily very sympathetic or very humble, although that's part of it. It's more about a leader or a kind of person who changes the world, but is in touch with very sensitive in touch with the world that's around them. So they could be humble, they could be directive, they could be very flexible, but it's someone who's got this really sort of deep embodied connection with the world around them, and they're really seeking to change things.
And I guess we have, which we'll come to a bit in the interview, some very traditional ideas of what leadership looks like, what a traditional hero looks like. And part of what I'm aware of, this is a very new way, in a sense, of thinking about that. Before we come into that, I'm curious to hear a bit about your background and your kind of journey to the work that you're doing now and this understanding. So how did you get interested in leadership and this area?
It's a good question. I suppose I've always kind of been interested in it. I mean, I think when I was growing up as a kid, I was kind of interested in politics, and I had these ideas that maybe I could become a politician or something. And then I worked in Parliament for a while as an environmental lobbyist. And the closer I got to power, very often the less impressed I was by the people who had, in classical terms, the power, in terms of their ability to hold the values that I held as being important. But I noticed there were many people in the world that I was very impressed by and exhibited the qualities that I thought were important, but they often existed on the margins or, interestingly, had been on a path to a classical leadership role, CEO or whatever, but had consciously moved from that into an environment which allowed them to be more authentic.
So say a bit more about the traditional leadership role. So what would be the characteristics or the qualities of a leader in a kind of traditional format?
Yeah, I mean, there are many different ways of thinking about this. And people have been talking about heroic leadership for, I think, hundreds of years. But it's really people who are sort of strong-minded, single-minded, very focused, often very expert. And Robert Keegan, the American academic at Harvard, he talks about people who are at the self-authoring mind, whereby they tend to have a very clear sense of what is right and what is wrong and who they are and what they need to do. And the world that we're living likes that kind of clear, black and white interpretation of things. The media, etc., really supports that kind of clarity. And so do our institutions. So very often we've got systems which have bred that kind of self-authoring person to run our institutions, or indeed often run our communities and that kind of thing.
Because it's like when we look to leadership in traditional sense, we look for someone that has certainty and has a sense of this is how it is, this is what we're going to do. And somehow that gives people a sense of security, I guess. But of course, in reality, and this is part of what I found so interesting in your book, that part of what I think you explain very well is that real life isn't like that. And you give the example, for example, of climate change, that it's not like you can say, right, this is what needs to be done, this is how we're going to do it. That those kind of complex problems need a different kind of leadership. Say a bit more about that.
I mean, I think we just look at our own lives. I think in my opinion, the macro is a reflection of the micro. And look at our own lives and the relationships we have, or in terms of managing our families or our budget. I mean, we don't know how much money we're going to have in a year's time. Not even if you're a civil servant who's got the pension things in place. I mean, you don't know if you're going to get a cut.
Especially at the moment.
Probably, especially at the moment. And I actually think something happened in 2008, speaking about the moment, whereby I think many people who'd been close to the elites had always been aware that our journalists or our politicians were fallible. It was kind of obvious that these people, had limitations. But for many people across society, they were far away. We had this kind of artificial sense that our captains of industry or our politicians were somehow better than us, or somehow more qualified than us. And I think the end of deference since 2008 has been ultimate, because we now know that nobody's in charge. I mean, it's very obvious. There's an academic called Moses who talks about that now. And if you look over the last 50 years in particular, any of the traditional power holders, be it around conflict or in politics or other areas, are finding it much harder to achieve change. Partly because we've got a much more egalitarian value set, particularly in the West, so people won't take instructions as easily, but also partly because things are becoming more interdependent. If the Swedes could solve climate change, they would have done it 20 years ago, but they can't. It depends upon other people out there, and that interdependency and that's so very obvious today, be it from the 2004 tsunami or to the more recent kind of events in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, etc. The interdependence is so very obvious. And I think we can feel it. If you look at films like Gravity, or indeed just the way in which we are able to have relationships with people all around the world and simultaneously through Facebook, etc., we can feel that we're part of this great, changing in global consciousness, and that interdependency is very obvious. But I think for many of us, we feel overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, and one of the things I just want to pick up on a bit more that you said around 2008 and the economic crash, that I think one of the things that was so interesting about that is it's like something as fundamental as the financial system, which just feels like it's almost just it's the fabric, in a sense, everything's built upon, suddenly started to disintegrate before our eyes. And it looked like at one point it could totally disintegrate. And as you say, that really changed people's perceptions of what's certain. And taking that back to leadership, again, one of the things that was very interesting in Antihero was this idea that with these complex problems, there are not clear, certain answers, and therefore what ultimately we need is leaders that can hold that kind of uncertainty. And yet it's really fascinating how, especially with politicians in this country, it's like a politician gets something wrong, and in the UK, the press basically assassinate them by media, where rather than having a potential that someone makes a mistake and they learn from that and they potentially become wiser in that role through their mistakes. It's like they've made a mistake, they're fallible, that's it. So it seems like it's the opposite of what's needed to support the evolution of more anti-heroes.
I think that's very true, and that's why one of the arguments that I'm making at the moment is I don't think we can expect a new generation of leadership to come from our leaders. I think the burn of the spotlight of the media, it's too great. And even Obama, who I happen to think has done a really good job, there's been all kinds of criticism of him anyway, but more recently they've been talking about how he hasn't done very much. And I would suggest that what he's done is he's avoided doing some really bad things. But the corollary of that is that the media have been really picking him apart again in the States for basically being ineffective and not making good use of his time in office. And I think it's extremely hard for any leader adopting what I call an anti-heroic, a sensitive, adaptive, flexible approach, or vulnerable approach to function. But I think we can see ourselves in our own lives. We can start to model that. So I think the new revolution in leadership, it's just not going to come from our leaders. It almost can't come from our leaders. It has to come from us. Yeah,
and that makes sense. And, it's really, there's something as well about the relationship that I think people often have to leadership is somewhat of I think it can be like a childlike or adolescent, like you failed me, you let me down, rather than recognizing the great difficulty of leadership, and having to make complicated, difficult decisions that potentially affect many, many people. What would you say supports, for people that are watching this, that, for example, are in, let's say, start with those in leadership positions, what supports someone living with more uncertainty? Because that's, in a sense, I guess, part of the evolution is the ability to not know and yet be in a position of having to take action from that place. What facilitates that?
Yeah, what can we do?
That?
I mean, it's another great question. I've been thinking a lot about this actually because I've just been looking at how we develop leadership or how we learn, and quite a lot. In fact, a lot of people have been talking about something like anti-heroic leadership for about 50 years. But this is a really interesting area where theory does lead practice. And I think it's because, as we've already discussed, the system doesn't allow the leaders we need to come to the top. But there's been one or two, and there's, from what I can tell, but very few people looking at how do we breed these sensitive anti-heroes. But a guy called Bill Torber and David Rook, they looked at it. And in fact, the Harvard Business Review said their paper was one of the best of the last 20 years or something like that, which is pretty impressive. And given that no one's read it, it's amazing. It's like really amazing, but no one's read it. I think they, but
that's a problem.
It is a problem. It is a problem. I think, I mean, although I do think that paper is wonderful, one of the things that I really noticed is that when I was writing Antihero, a lot of the celebrated academics and thinkers in that space whose work I've essentially just translated didn't like what I was doing. I got a lot of pushback from that world because I was using words that were quite clear. Because in writing Antihero, I've been trying to not communicate perhaps to people like us who think, oh yeah, we all should be open and agile and sensitive. I don't think we're the audience really that really matters right now. I think it is the 80% that don't get that. And so I think one of the real big barriers, I actually think for the consciousness movement as a whole, but certainly for the conscious leadership movement, if you like, is that they talk in a language that does accurately reflect what they do. But to people who aren't part of that movement, who have got all the power, usually, they don't get it. And they just dismiss it as, mumbo jumbo, fluffy. And I think there's a real challenge to us in that space to recognize why it might be obvious to us, but it is actually not obvious to other people.
Yes. And I guess it's also, it's one thing to live with uncertainty, to explore ourselves, to let ourselves get it wrong in the sphere of our own self-development. And it's very easy from that place to judge people in positions of leadership and say, they should be softer, they should be. But when someone's in a position of leadership, and I find it very interesting the level of criticism that politicians get in this country, when actually it's an incredibly, especially a cabinet minister, incredibly demanding in terms of responsibility, hours work, decisions that are needed, complexity to be managed, and how easy it is to hone in on one decision that someone's taken and dismiss them and make it wrong and reject it. But for someone in a position of great responsibility, to be able to learn to be uncertain and learn to live with that, and to learn to be seen to be vulnerable when there's a media that's kind of waiting to assassinate them, in a sense, by media. How does someone in that position start to evolve in the way? Because part of what I know what you're talking about is an inner development in people, in leadership, so they can then lead from a different place. What supports that?
Yeah, I mean, my interpretation of what you're saying is this balance between sensitivity and resilience. And I think that that what we want is leaders who are very sensitive, but we do need, because it's a catastrophically tough environment, very resilient leaders. And if I just speak from my own perspective, because that's my main reference point for this, is that 15 years ago, or however long ago it was, I was an environmental lobbyist. I remember I used to walk into Parliament, I used to argue with businesses, I used to be meeting ministers, and I would really be, basically pushing my point. And I would get a lot of criticism, a lot of flack, but I didn't care because I was so clear that I was right and what I was doing was correct. And in a much smaller way, I have been giving a lot of talks about Antihero recently, and I've been getting quite a lot of flack on Twitter and Facebook from some of my old colleagues, and some of it's been very personally abusive, but that's a bit of a strong word to use. But anyway, it's been very directly critical of me. Yes. And myself 10 years ago wouldn't have given a damn. I'd have just thought, they're wrong, I'm right. But now I do care. And I'm just really, in terms of certainly how I'm managing that, so very personally, is by surrounding myself with people who understand what I'm trying to do, respects it, and can reassure me that I might be getting the flack, but I'm not crazy. And there are also, I certainly have to create lots of space in my life to allow myself to sort of ground and to learn almost in an embodied sense, how is it that I can expel my energy. And I know you and I both like to do exercise regularly. Right. And I find that at the moment, if I don't go running or if I don't go to the gym every day, it's a problem. And I think for me, it's as I've got more in touch with my body, and the only way I managed to expel the, if you like, the detritus of the day that one picks up as a sensitive being,
Right.
it just goes somewhere else and is unhelpful.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things. It's a great point you bring up, that coexistence of strength and certainty with vulnerability and sensitivity, and it's a very, most people either do one or the other.
Yeah.
So people, it's like they're solid, they're certain, that's the way it is, or they're kind of sensitive in their feeling and they're open. But in that place, it's like take a decision where, for example, let's say a politician take a decision and a bunch of people are going to lose their jobs. It's the right thing ultimately for the organism of the country, but it's difficult for some of those people.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you do that if you're sensitized to everyone's feelings and everyone's experience? Would one way to put it, it's an integration of masculine and feminine. I don't know if that's a way that you've thought about it or talked about it before, but it feels like there's the certainty of and the kind of the strength of masculine with the sensitivity and the kind of connectedness of the feminine. Am I off track, or is that?
I think that is definitely one way of doing of describing it, and I think. I think it's always difficult territory when we get on to caricaturing masculine or feminine. So that's my kind of hesitation. But one thing I will say is that so many of our institutions, like from our schools to universities to Hollywood, are creating this what I call the heroic ideal, and it's I think a classical, quite masculine version of that heroism as we described at the start, and I think that is problematic.
It's true, of course. You think about movies,
yeah.
And it's kind of we romanticize this kind of male strong, that takes all these probably quite physical hits like fighting and strength and leading, but that's when you meet something like climate change, this doesn't work, right?
And I think the key really important thing, I think that's why it's so relevant to what we're talking about today, is the difference between informative learning and transformative learning. And basically, informative learning is just learning more stuff, putting more data on the hard drive. Transformative learning is transforming who you are, how you think, expansion of consciousness, that's a key part of it. And what's really interesting is there seems to be consensus amongst the kind of academic and kind of thinking community around leadership. We need people who are more agile, more flexible. That means they need to be transformed. They need to transform. They need to have a high level of consciousness. But actually, they're very, very weak on how to do that. But that's where the consciousness community comes in, because it could be meditation, it can be putting yourself outside your comfort zone. I had a really interesting conversation with this guy at the Center for Creative Leadership in Boulder, who are really leading this thinking. And he was talking to the guys at Google, and he said that what they do is they frame break their staff. So that they get them to really think in radically new ways, which I think is particularly relevant for their technical staff. Mm-hmm. But what was really interesting, and I think it's again a real challenge for the kind of consciousness movement, is that he found that sending everyone away on retreats wasn't that useful, because when they got back to their desk, they couldn't integrate it. It was just such an unreal situation. And so he developed this idea which he called suboptimal leadership development, whereby he makes the process much more like their messy day-to-day lives. And it's a much more integrative way of doing it. And I think I think that talks a little bit to your kind of consciousness 2.0 stuff.
Right. And
I think there's I think it's kind of really interesting.
Yeah, and one of the things that I really liked towards the end of the book, you were talking about what needs to be in place in terms of transformative learning for our leaders. And I don't remember the exact details, but you were talking about, for example, a percentage of budget of learning and development being used for transformative learning. Say something about that. I mean, it makes total sense. But.
I think in most organisations, well, maybe not so much these days with the cuts, but for most professions, there is a budget for developing yourself. But it tends to go more kind of informative learning. Yes. You go on a training course to learn Prince 2 qualifications. I'm saying kind of only do the informative learning if you really need to. But look, our smartphones, our tablets, they're always going to be able to remember and process stuff better than we ever are. And I think, in terms of our learning as beings, we're only just beginning to realise the enormous potential of these portals that are onto the world's biggest ever and most powerful invention. And one of the things that really means is we don't need to learn the same stuff. We don't need to read perhaps as many books as we did before, because we can access that information much more quickly. What we can't do is transform who we are, expand our consciousness. And a really simple example of this is I was drawing a diagram of people with different levels of consciousness, just as an event the other day. And the problem with when you have a contracted level of consciousness is you don't know what you don't know.
Yes.
And so, although you can be experts tend to know an awful lot about not very much. And often there's some of the anti-heroes tend to know not very much about an awful lot.
Yes.
And if you're a strategic way of operating, that's much more useful, because at least you're conscious of your incompetence. And when you're conscious of your incompetence, you can fill that, or you can get someone in to help you with that. But the real problem we have is so many of our experts running the world have known an awful lot about very little. And in our interconnected world, that's just a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we've got a couple of minutes left. What's your aspiration of what you would like to see happen? You know, the long-term picture makes sense. You want more anti-heroes.
Yeah.
What's your aspiration of how you see that happening? I mean, part of what you just said is part of the answer, but on a kind of bigger level, in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, where would you like to see this country and other countries in terms of leadership, organisations, politically?
Yeah. Well, I think let's look at schools. I think schools should seriously consider forgetting things like numeracy and literacy as a benchmark. Because I think you can learn those things reasonably quickly through our electronic media. And they should look at, it's almost going back to a Victorian ideal of how do we, support and grow people who can cope with today's world. So I think it's much more about that nurturing people as a holistic being than as opposed to this narrow notion of being able to read and write and learn engineering. I did an engineering degree. I'm all for having great scientists, 100%. But I think it's looking at reconfiguring how we learn and our lives, which are about, and I think it's that classic idea of instilling that idea for lifelong learning. But it's not this, when you go into any house around here in North London, all of our shelves are covered with our books. And it's kind of like a great homage to our great informative learning. And I think, look, I'd like to see...
Don't touch my bookshelf.
Exactly. I'd like to see us, give them all to Oxfam, sell them all, and instead focus much more on actually ourselves and how we can transform ourselves.
Yeah. One of the things that's fascinating is that you can have all the knowledge in the world around something but have no real experience. Like you could read about enlightenment till the end of time and never have an experience of something happen.
Exactly.
Look, great. Thank you, Richard.
Pleasure.
The book's called Anti-Hero.
That's
Is there a website that we can give people for it?
Yeah. If you go to oscar.co, it's there.
Brilliant.
Or
great.
Put my name into Google or something.
Great, brilliant. Thank you, Richard. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to talking with you again, hopefully very soon. Bye-bye.